Ferrari had Lewis Hamilton in the car, Charles Leclerc at the front, and the first race of Formula One's new era right in their hands. But Melbourne still slipped away before most people even understood why. That is what makes this story so dangerous for Ferrari. This was not some slow collapse that built over 50 laps. It was fast, quiet, and brutal. One small window opened, one warning came from inside the cockpit, and the team let the moment pass. By the time the full damage showed up on the timing screens, the race already belonged to someone else. What makes it worse is that Ferrari did not look weak when this started. They looked ready. Leclerc had seized control early, Hamilton was moving through the field, and the SF26 had the kind of race pace that should have kept both red cars deep in the fight. Meanwhile, Mercedes were still trying to turn opportunity into control. George Russell finished the job. Kimi Antonelli made it even bigger, and suddenly the conversation after race 1 was not about Ferrari's promise. It was about the decision that changed everything. The real story was never about the final result. It was about the moment Ferrari stopped shaping the race and started chasing it. And that is why this hits harder than a normal strategy debate. Hamilton did not wait until after the flag to understand the danger. He saw it while the race was still alive. While the choice was still there, while Ferrari still had time to protect themselves from what was coming next. That is the sting in all of this. A new season, new regulations, new pressure, and the first major warning came from the most experienced driver on the grid, only for Ferrari to keep going in the wrong direction. To understand how that happened, you have to start with the new rules and the chaos they created from the very first laps. The race was not only moving fast, it was changing shape every lap. Melbourne became the first real stress test for Formula One's new rules, and the cars were behaving in ways no team could fully trust yet. George Russell had pole, Charles Leclerc had already grabbed the lead, and Lewis Hamilton was charging forward, but none of that guaranteed control for more than a few corners at a time. The old rhythm was gone. These cars were now asking drivers to manage battery use, straight line timing, and grip in a far more unforgiving way, and that is where the trap started to form. The numbers behind the new era made that danger real. The MG UK now delivers 350 kilowatts. The power split is much closer between the engine and the electrical side. An active aero changes how these cars attack the straight and defend into the braking zone. That is why the first phase of this race looks so unstable. One lap, a driver had the run. The next lap, that edge could disappear. Russell, Leclerc, Hamilton, and Kimi Antonelli were not just racing each other. They were learning where the real limit of these cars lived under pressure, and nobody had a clean answer yet. That is why Ferrari's early pace mattered so much, because surviving the opening chaos should have given them the platform to control what came next. They had the lead car, they had Hamilton moving into the fight, and they had a chance to turn a messy race into a manageable one before the field settled down. But here is what the paddock is not talking about. Once this new formula forced everyone into energy management and timing games, the team with the clearest picture would own the race. And inside that picture, Ferrari were about to face the moment that really decided Melbourne. From the outside, those early laps looked wild. Inside the teams, the picture was much colder. This was no longer only about who could attack into turn 1 or hold position through sector 2. It was about who could shape the race before the race shaped them. Ferrari had Leclerc out front and Hamilton closing into the lead group, which should have given them the strongest hand on the grid. Two cars in play means options, pressure, and freedom to force rivals into reacting first. Nobody in that garage expected what came next because Ferrari were sitting in the exact position most teams want before strategy starts to bite. Mercedes understood the danger immediately. Russell was still close enough to strike, Antonelli was recovering into the fight, and McLaren stayed alert with Lando Norris ready to react the moment the race changed. That matters because Ferrari were not surrounded by passive rivals waiting for mistakes. They were surrounded by teams ready to turn one opening into a full race swing. The real story was never about the lap time, it was about leverage. Ferrari had two cars that could shape the next phase. But that only works if the pit wall treats both of them like separate weapons instead of tying them to the same outcome. That is why this next moment carried so much weight. Ferrari were not defending from weakness, they were choosing from strength, and that makes every second more important. A lead car can protect position, a second car can cover the rival move. A team with both should control the rhythm of the afternoon. But control in Formula 1 only lasts until race control throws one variable into the air and asks every pit wall to answer instantly. The first real answer came on lap 12, and that is where Hamilton saw the race more clearly than the people calling it. Lap 12 gave Ferrari the kind of opening teams spend whole Sundays waiting for. The virtual safety car slowed the field, cut the cost of a pit stop, and handed every strategist a fast decision with huge consequences. Mercedes did not hesitate. George Russell came in, Kimi Antonelli came in, McLaren reacted as well. Ferrari stayed out with both cars, and in that split second, the race stopped being about who had the quickest package and started becoming about who understood the moment first. Hamilton did. Before the shape of the race had fully changed, he was already on the radio saying what Ferrari needed to hear. That is the detail that gives this moment its weight. Hamilton was not guessing. He was watching the order around him, seeing two Mercedes commit and reading the danger before it fully arrived. His point was simple and sharp. At least one Ferrari needed to box, not both. Not a full surrender of track position, just one car to cover the move and keep Ferrari alive on both sides of the strategy. That would have left Leclerc and Hamilton on different roads, which is exactly what strong teams want when the race is still open. Instead, Ferrari kept both drivers tied to one choice, and one choice meant one mistake could damage everything. That is where this story gets complicated. Ferrari were not making a random call, they were gambling on another interruption later in the race. Another chance to stop more cheaply and keep track position at the same time. On paper, that sounds calm and clever. In reality, it meant turning a live opportunity into a waiting game against race control, tire life, and pure timing. Hamilton had already spotted the safer move, and Ferrari still chose the riskier one. The next twist is what turned that risk into a real loss, because the second chance Ferrari waited for did arrive, just not in the way they needed. Ferrari got the second interruption they were waiting for, and it still did not save them. That is what makes this stretch of the race so brutal. The gamble was not crazy because another neutralization really did arrive, but the moment it came, the situation turned against them almost instantly. Valtteri Bottas stopped near pit entry. The lane was shut, and the clean answer Ferrari had been hoping for disappeared before it could be used. This is the part that changes everything. A strategy bet only works if the next window stays open long enough to cash it in, and Ferrari were now trapped inside the very scenario Hamilton had tried to protect them from. The painful part is that the race was still offering clues. Bernie Collins pointed to the short reaction window before the closure, which only made the whole thing feel tighter and more uncomfortable. Martin Brundle's read was just as sharp, because once Ferrari lost track position control, the rest of the race began to tilt toward Mercedes. Russell was now sitting on fresher tires, Antonelli had the same advantage, and Ferrari had no second path left to play. The data tells a completely different story. This was no longer only about who had the quickest car over one lap. It became about who had put themselves in the strongest shape for the next stint. From there, the pressure changed form. Leclerc was still ahead on paper, but the race around him had already moved on, and Hamilton knew it. Ferrari had waited for the safer moment, only for that safer moment to become the exact point where the race slipped further out of reach. Once Mercedes had the tire advantage and Ferrari had both cars locked to older rubber, the next laps were always going to ask the same hard question. Could raw pace still rescue them, or had the real damage already been done before anyone reached the next braking zone? Ferrari's explanation after the race sounded neat, but it did not close the case. The team line was that Mercedes had stronger pace on the hard tire and would have been difficult to beat anyway. There is truth in that. And pretending otherwise would be lazy. George Russell had speed, Kimi Antonelli was strong as well, and Mercedes clearly understood that compound better in the closing phase. But that answer only works if strategy had already done everything it could. It had not. Ferrari were not beaten only by pace. They were hurt by the way they reduced their own options before the race reached its most important phase. That is why Hamilton's view matters so much here. He was not saying both Ferraris had to pit together and copy Mercedes exactly. He was arguing for cover, for one car to react, one car to stay flexible, and one chance to survive if the race swung in an unexpected direction. That is a very different argument. Charles Leclerc defended the original choice as a deliberate one, and from inside Ferrari, that logic is understandable, because a second interruption really did look possible. But once both cars were committed to the same road, Ferrari stopped managing the race and started hoping it would come back to them. And hope is a weak tool when the field is this sharp. That is why the pace defense starts to crack under pressure. Even if Mercedes had the better closing stint, Ferrari still made the fight cleaner for them by giving up the only layer of protection that could have kept one red car in range. Hamilton saw the safer version of the race while it was still available, and Ferrari chose the version that left them exposed. The hard part now is that this does not feel like an isolated call, because the more you look at it, the more it starts to resemble something Ferrari have shown before. Melbourne hurts more when you place it next to the races Ferrari still cannot fully outrun. Silverstone in 2022, Monaco in 2022, Hungary in 2022, Singapore in 2019, different tracks, different conditions, different rivals. But the same uneasy feeling once the pressure moved from the drivers to the pit wall. In each case, Ferrari had enough speed to stay in the fight and enough opportunity to protect the result. Yet the decisive moment slipped away when the race demanded a fast and flexible answer. That is why this story feels so heavy. Fans have seen the shape of it before, even when the details change. The pattern is not about one bad idea repeated forever. It is about hesitation, either about holding both cars on the same path too long, about reacting after the window has already started closing. Charles Leclerc has lived through that side of Ferrari more than once, and now Lewis Hamilton has stepped into the same tension almost immediately. What no broadcast covered is this: Ferrari did not just sign a 7-time world champion for pace and profile. They signed a driver whose greatest strength has often been reading the race as it unfolds. Odds of feeling danger before it fully shows itself, and forcing the right conversation onto the radio at exactly the right second. That is why Melbourne now feels bigger than the points on the board. Hamilton saw the safer route, Ferrari stayed on the riskier one, and the result brought back questions that were already waiting under the surface. This was supposed to be a fresh chapter, new regulations, new partnership, new momentum, but the old pressure returned almost immediately. And once that happens, the story stops being about one stop and starts becoming about whether Ferrari can actually absorb what Hamilton is trying to give them before this season moves on without them. Mercedes left Melbourne with the win, a 1-2 finish, and the kind of calm that sends a message to the whole paddock. George Russell delivered the result, Kimi Antonelli backed it up, and Ferrari walked away with solid points that still felt far too light for the speed they showed at key moments. And that is the final twist in this story. The result was respectable, but the feeling around it was not. Ferrari did not leave looking slow. They left looking unresolved, and that can be more damaging at the start of a new era, because every rival now knows the red car may be quick enough to threaten, yet still vulnerable when the race turns messy. That is why this race cannot be dismissed as opening round noise. The teams now head deeper into a season shaped by new power demands, new timing calls, odds, and new pressure on every pit wall decision. Ferrari still have Leclerc, still have Hamilton, and still have a car that can sit in the fight when the pace is there. But the question hanging over them is no longer just about setup, tire life, or clean air. It is about whether the team can act with the same sharpness their drivers are already showing from inside the cockpit when the next decisive moment arrives. And that is the answer to the question that has been hanging over this whole story. 1. Ferrari did not lose Melbourne only because Mercedes were quicker in the final phase. They lost the shape of the race when Hamilton spotted the safer move and the pit wall stayed committed to a narrower path. That is why the aftermath feels so important. If Ferrari learned from this immediately, Melbourne becomes an early warning that sharpened them. If they do not, it becomes the first sign that even a new chapter with Hamilton may still be haunted by the same old weakness.